I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles, but I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
All right, well, welcome to the Lone Bulwark. Thank you for joining me. I want to remind you guys that I am starting a new series called the Scholar Series. I'm going to go through logic, Aristotle. I'm basically going to cover as much as I can over the course of, I don't know, years, I suppose. All the background, the sort of learning that your Reformed forefathers learned that we didn't learn in public school, which I didn't learn in public school either. I learned it in private in graduate school. So it's just an opportunity for, guys in college or in seminary or in 20s, 30s, 40s, however old you are. It's oriented towards adults to learn the sort of learning that is a background behind the books that you're reading, from Calvin to Turretin to those guys. So check that out, Scholar Series. It's on my Patreon, patreon.com/Stephen Wolfe, Stephen with a PH and Wolfe with an E. You'll find it there. You'll find the different options for that. All right, so today I want to talk about an article from the Ezra Institute. Now, the guys at the Ezra Institute don't like me. I don't dislike them. I just disagree with them. I think they don't like me. But anyway, that doesn't matter. There's an article today. It's on total depravity, and I agree with one of the premises, I guess, which is that total depravity is very important for politics, in several different ways. I won't go into, but I do agree that when you get whatever your view of total depravity is, will shape your politics. And since the Ezra Institute is all about politics, they even have an article about Christmas and politics for whatever reason. I'd rather spend the day on Christmas Day without thinking about politics, but you can check that out as well. So there's a little plug for whatever that was. But I'm going to talk about this article. It's an article by Stephen Perks. Let's see if I can pull this off. There we go. It's an article by Stephen Perks. I think he's in the CREC. I really don't know exactly who he is, but it doesn't matter. The article is perfectly, intelligent and all that, but I disagree with it. And I think it follows an error that's very common in the 20th century theology, Reformed theology, largely because it's divorced from the actual sources of the tradition. I think maybe because it was buried in Latin. Something happened in the 20th century from influence from Van Til and others that led the Reformed tradition down a road essentially antithetical to the actual tradition, which is very strange. It's not a development. It's actually I'd say devolution. But anyway, this article is about total depravity, and I think it will clarify my disagreements, and I think it will show that I'm actually on the side of the Reformers and Ezra Institute is not. From what I can tell from the Ezra Institute, their distinctive beliefs, you can't even trace them to Kuyper and Bavinck. Maybe Duisverd, who no one reads because he's nearly impossible to read, and also kind of late 20th century theologies. But their distinctives are not rooted in the Reformed tradition. I mean, postmillennialism is not distinctive to people in the Ezra Institute. It is found in the Reformed tradition. I think early on, it's not the most popular view. I'd say that they actually would call that a Jewish view. And they'd be more like what we'd call amillennial, but whatever, that's not the subject of this discussion. We're talking about the total depravity. So this is what he says in one of the paragraphs, kind of the early paragraphs. He says, this perspective denies the total depravity since the fall, implying that sin is not pervasive and does not affect all man's thoughts, words, actions outside of Christ. Okay, so that what he's talking about here, let me see if I can scroll up here. Yeah, he's talking about the Roman Catholic doctrine. I don't know if I want to jump there right away. Yeah, I'll do that. So he goes into in the Roman Catholic doctrine. Let's start from here. Between image of God, natural reason. So there's a distinction between the image of God and the likeness of God. Now, I'm sure someone in the Reformed tradition has made this distinction. My understanding is that the majority position in the Reformed tradition is that likeness and the image in Genesis is referring to the same thing. I would agree with that position. And then he goes on to say the likeness was considered a supernatural gift, bestowed upon Adam in addition to his human nature. Now, in some Roman Catholic theologies, you do see this. I don't know if it's the most popular today. You do see in people like Bellarmine. I think actually Thomas Aquinas is perhaps contradictory on this, or at the very least does not affirm this view precisely. So it's the Roman Catholic position where there's nature and grace, and they're like dual substances. In a way, they're separate things. And you have human nature, which apart from grace can be intact, but there's from concupiscence, there's this draw down to earthly things away from the heavenly. So there can be a state of innocence apart from this addition, but the addition is a sort of what Bellarmine called a golden bridle. So once you have grace, once you're in a state of grace, which means you have this added substance to you, you're held firm from slipping. And so original sin for that Roman Catholic, kind of the Bellarmine position, is that you lose grace, and therefore, because you have a natural tendency downward to the things, but you still remain intact. Now, again, I don't think this is, I don't know if this is codified in Trent, but whether it is or isn't, I think Thomas Aquinas actually would not, in fact, Bellarmine in his work on this, argued against Thomas Aquinas. So there is actually, I'd say, division in the tradition, in the Roman Catholic tradition on this very point. And I would say the Protestant reformers and the Protestant scholastics actually took the side of Thomas Aquinas, and not the side of the Ezra Institute, as we'll get into. This led to a division between two realms, nature and grace. I wouldn't say, hold on a second. It's kind of rainy day. I had my window open. It's kind of warm in here. I don't want to mess up the audio, but two realms of nature and grace. Now, I would say it would be more like two substances of nature and grace. Redemption occurs in the realm of grace, not nature, which is largely unaffected by the fall or redemption. Now, that's a little imprecise, but it's fair enough for someone like Bellarmine. I'm not going to knock him on that. So they would deny then total depravity, and implying that sin is not pervasive, does not affect all of man's thoughts, actions, blah, blah, blah. Because there's this dunum superaddendum. So the grace is the superadded gift, set of gifts that then keeps nature in check. So again, Roman Catholic system, you can be in a state of innocence with just your pure human nature, but grace is necessary to keep that nature, which has a sort of natural drawing down to the things of the earth, or to sin. And grace is that golden bridle that keeps you there. Grace is necessary to restore communion with God and to understand the supernatural revelations in Scripture. Meanwhile, the book of nature is accessible to all, and through natural abilities, people can attain a proper understanding of it. Now, again, I think this is imprecise, because I would say the reformers, including Calvin, would actually affirm that last statement, that indeed the book of nature is accessible to all, and through natural abilities can attain a proper understanding of it. I will show that in a moment through Calvin's writings, that is actually what he believes. So there is a common, so you see in Van Til, he juxtaposed Reformed and Roman Catholic in ways that are just simply ahistorical. And so the children of Van Til and Duiveerd and these other guys have adopted that line, which I think has been thoroughly refuted in scholarship. It's been, now with new translations, it's thoroughly refuted. And indeed, if you just read Calvin himself, you would know that it's refuted. But this juxtaposition of Roman Catholic and Reformed on all sorts of things is simply not the case. There are differences, but the differences stated by people like Van Til and others, I think, are false. So man is not totally depraved, but partially fallen. Okay. Again, that juxtapositioning total depravity and partial fallenness is not the right juxtaposition. Because total depravity, as he actually defines later, is that every aspect of man is in some regard fallen, but that doesn't mean that we are utterly fallen, such that every part of our faculties is in itself corrupt, as if our soul itself is evil. The Reformed rejected the proposition that the essence of our soul is actually corrupted, that the essence of our soul is evil. They rejected that position. He quotes Thomas Aquinas: "The natural inclination of virtue is let's go there. The constitution of human nature is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin." That's the constitution, that what's constitutive of man. That's what Thomas Aquinas is referring to. That is the essential features of man are not destroyed or diminished by sin. That is the essential features of them in themselves. The gift of original righteousness was totally lost through the sin of our first parent. That would be the sort of gifts. The nature of man with regard to the gracious gifts, the higher gifts. They were totally lost through sin of our first parents. Now, the natural inclination to virtue is diminished by sin. So that's from Thomas Aquinas. For him, original sin is not subject to original sin is desire not subject to reason, and sin is the fall short of the good which berefs one according to one's nature. Okay, so that's apparently the Roman Catholic position. It turns out that is actually the Calvin's position. In fact, he says almost exactly this in his Institutes. I'll get to in a second. Human nature is not so entirely corrupted by sin as to be deprived of natural good altogether. That is a standard Reformed position. You still are, because you're created by God, those constitutive features of you are good. The soul in itself it's like you still are, it's not utterly evil and corrupted. Okay, that is the Roman Catholic position. Grace does not abolish nature, but perfects it. So we'll get to that in a minute. So salvation does not totally transform one man's life and culture, but merely perfects them as they are perceived as completely fallen. The fallen is viewed in religious terms. That's precisely what Bavinck says, as you'll see in a second. So this is attributed to Roman Catholics, but Bavinck says it. It just supports my contention that the theology of the Ezra Institute is not even rooted in the originators of Neo-Calvinism, but it's actually a late 20th century innovation in Neo-Calvinism, following some of the obscure philosopher Duiverd. The Christian faith is a nature. The Christian faith is a synthesis of nature and grace, with grace completing nature. That is the most common position in all of the Reformed tradition you'll find up until the 20th century, by the way. But let's jump let's go to Calvin. So this is from his second volume, book 2, section 12. You'll see right off the bat that Calvin is affirming a dualism, that there are natural gifts, see here, natural gifts, and there are these supernatural gifts. Oops. And he distinguishes the next one. The natural gifts concern the things of our earthly life, and the supernatural gifts concern our pursuit of heavenly life. So that's another dualism, earthly versus heavenly. All the reformers, not all the reformers, most Reformation theologians, the majority position is that even Adam in his state of integrity, was promised not just perpetual life on earth, but a state of glory in heaven, or a sort of heavenly life. That was affirmed across the board. It's affirmed by Calvin, it's affirmed by Luther. And there's a minority of people who denied that, such as Thomas Goodwin denied that. And I've seen no one else. There's some modern Reformed theologians who deny it, but I know there's others, but the majority position is the dualism that Adam was the promise to Adam in the covenant of works was a state of glory, described as something elevated above earthly life, described in the tradition as heavenly life. But anyway, it says, which would have been sufficient for the attainment of heavenly life and everlasting felicity. Man, when he withdrew his allegiance to God, was deprived of the spiritual gifts by which he had been raised to the hope of eternal salvation. So remember how they're criticizing Thomas Aquinas for saying that the higher gifts were withdrawn, and the other and that's not what happened to the other gifts. Hence it follows that he is now an exile from the kingdom of God, and so all things which pertain to the blessed life of the soul are extinguished in him until he recover them by the grace of regeneration. So what does grace do? Grace is principally the recovery of those higher gifts such that you can orient your life to the higher kingdom, heavenly kingdom of God. That's precisely what they're accusing Roman Catholics of believing. And by the way, this is the view of Turretin, this is the view of Junius, this is the view of Zanchius, this is the view of the majority position of the Reformed tradition until the 20th century, and I'd argue this is the view of Bavinck himself. Again, the position that rejects this is a 20th century innovation of the Reformed tradition. When restored to us by Christ are to be regarded as adventitious and above nature. All right, so we'll get to Turretin in a minute when he distinguishes different ways we can talk about nature. On the other hand, soundness of mind, integrity of heart, were at the same time withdrawn, and it is this which constitutes the corruption of natural gifts. So there is the corruption of natural gifts. All right, so in the Reformed position, the nature grace elements at the founding, I'm talking about American founding here, at creation, you don't separate them in dual substances, but they are distinguished. And I'll get to this in more detail when I get to Turretin. But the higher gifts were, you might say, accidental, meaning they could be withdrawn without destroying man, as a human being. But these natural earthly gifts are essential to man as man. So in other words, they're constitutive of man. So they could not be withdrawn. If they were withdrawn, man would no longer be man. He would be a wholly different creature, and be destroyed. So there is a distinction of nature and grace in the Reformed tradition. In Calvin, the fall does principally withdraw those higher gifts, but in effect, the effect of withdrawing the higher gifts is the corruption of the natural gifts. So if you want to distinguish supernatural and natural, that's one way to do it. Junius does that. Turretin tries to do it, say they're both native and natural, and I'll talk about that. But in the Reformed position, nature and the things of nature and the things of grace at God's first creation of man, and man in his state of innocence required those higher gifts to be righteous. In the Roman Catholic position, reflected in Bellarmine, and I don't think reflected in Thomas Aquinas, is the view that if you remove those higher gifts, man is still in a state of integrity. It's when they then choose by will to sin, that's when they enter a state of corruption. The Reformed position is the withdrawal of the higher gifts is itself constitutes that makes man unrighteous. Okay, because he lacks that which perfected him. But the effect, the consequence of losing those means that the natural gifts are corrupted. So there is a difference between the Reformed and the Roman view on this, but both have a nature grace dualism, as these guys like to call it. They just understand the relationship of nature and grace differently. Okay. He says, being partly weakened and partly corrupted, a shapeless ruin is all that remains. Now, as you go further into this, he says that the principal thing that is lost are the first table duties. This is why they go into these gross corruptions when it comes to idolatry and religion. And so the shapeless ruin is principally in the failure to worship God. That's the principal effect of the fall, and not on the natural gifts, though those are corrupted. That's this idea of the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. It's the light of the eternal kingdom. It's the light of the promise of heavenly life. Okay. He says here, there are still some sparks which show that he is a rational animal that differs from the brutes. He's endued with intelligence, and yet this light is so smothered by clouds of darkness that it cannot shine forth to any good effect. In like manner, the will, because it's separable from Nina, did not perish, but was so enslaved by depraved lust as to be incapable of one righteous desire. Okay. Now, when you see righteous and you see good, all the Reformed believe that apart from grace, you cannot perform good in its totality. So there is a substance of good action that you can perform. So you can sacrifice for your nation. You can defend your wife and children from an unjust intrusion and violence. That would be an outwardly a good action. It's only good outwardly, because inwardly, apart from grace, you can't do anything in its complete good, because you can't do it to the glory of God in Christ. And so a Christian can perform a good work because they can perform what's outwardly good in substance to the glory of God. Okay, but a non-believer can't do that. And that's actually, you've lost the best part. The best part of any perfectly good work is that a good work has been done to the glory of God. But that doesn't destroy the ability for man to perform right action outwardly with actually good reason to perform that. Okay. But he says, though, to say that the intellect has perpetual blindness is repugnant, not only to the word of God, but common experience. He's appealing to experience now. So we've seen implanted in the human mind desire for an investigating truth, which sounds like the first line of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which is all men desire to know. There is therefore now in the human mind discerning extent is naturally influenced by the love of truth, neglect of which in the lower animals is a proof of their gross and irrational nature. Okay. Still, it is true that this love of truth fails before it reaches its goal. They cannot pursue the right path of investigation. Let's keep going. This is yeah. So again, as I said before, even though, as we'll see in a moment, man can actually know the principles of right action, they often fail to perform the right action, but also they can't do it to the glory of God, and also they cannot worship God well. Later on, I think in section 17 or 18, Calvin says that natural man is basically decently instructed in second table duties, and it's in the first table that they fail the most. But he says they're not so utterly fruitless as not to lead to some result, especially when directed to inferior objects. And then again, he distinguishes between the higher two classes of objects, a distinction between them. We have an intelligence of earthly things and heavenly things. By earthly, he means the things, does not relate to God and his kingdom, but confined to earthly life. Okay. Let's see. Right here it says, man is by nature a social animal. He is disposed from natural instinct to cherish and preserve society. It's raining pretty hard outside now. There we go. And we see that the minds of all men have impressions of civil order and honesty. Hence it is that every individual understands how human societies must be regulated by laws and also is able to comprehend the principles of those laws, right? So you have positive civil law, and they can see that positive civil law, and they can comprehend the natural principles behind those laws. Hence, universal agreement in regard to such subjects among nations and individuals, the seed of them being implanted in the breast of all without a teacher or lawgiver. That's appealing to Romans 2. The truth of this fact is not affected by wars and dissensions. Let's see, he goes in more. For while men dispute with each other as to particular enactments, their ideas of equity agree in substance. Okay. This proves the weakness of the human mind. Still, however, it is true that some principles of civil order is impressed on all. And this is ample proof that in regard to the constitution of the present life, no man is devoid of the light of reason. All right, so let's just back up a bit. Calvin affirms, we've already identified, I guess, like 3 different dualisms here. The earthly, heavenly. That's the first thing. Adam was placed on earth, but promised a higher heavenly home. In order for him to achieve that higher heavenly home, he was given 2 sets of gifts. One would be earthly, such that he can comprehend the principles of just action within earthly life, civil life, but also has those higher gifts that lead him to the proper worship of God and the pursuit of the higher end, namely heavenly life. Also, he recognized the grace of regeneration, meaning that grace regenerates man, and the principal effect of that is the restoration of the higher gifts. And in the restoration of the higher gifts, that then sets the lesser in order, the lower inferior goods in order. Again, the completeness of man is a product of those two sets of gifts. When one is gone, it corrupts the natural side, the natural, the earthly things. When those are restored, man is now complete because he has the full complement of gifts. There's still sin that remains, and yet that completeness is the basis, makes possible your sanctification, such that through grace you would be more conformed to the image of Christ. So, in other words, you become truly and completely human. So that's Calvin's position. Now that is different than the position that Ezra Institute is putting out. In fact, they say that there's some modern Protestants today hold a perspective similar to the Roman Catholic understanding. They are dualists, splitting life into spiritual and secular realms. They believe nature doesn't need redeeming because it isn't fallen, so conversion affects only the spiritual realm. Now, I don't know anyone who actually affirms that. There is, I guess you could say, the modern two kingdom guys, but the classical doctrine. But I don't even think they do actually have a separationist doctrine. But they do think that Christians acting in society can act to preserve the things of nature. So they do have something that appears like this. And I think actually being separationists, as I call them, there is a sort of dualism in there. The problem with the term dualism is that it's thrown out everywhere. So if you affirm the classical Protestant distinctions of sacred secular, heavenly earthly, inward outward, nature grace, civil spiritual sword, if you affirm those, there's dualisms all over the Protestant Reformed tradition. And it's because that is the broad Christian position. And why did that develop? Because in order to solve these various issues and problems within theology itself, I would contend that if you throw away the dualisms, your entire theology goes into whack. I mean, the other one would be invisible church and visible church. There's many others. If you read the confessions, the distinctions here, the dualisms are throughout the Reformed tradition, and to get rid of them, in fact, it wreaks havoc on your theological system and makes it incoherent. And you see this among some, like certain federal visionists. They, I guess to their credit, adopted this kind of neo-Kuyperian rejection of dualisms and ran with it. And you can see the havoc it did upon their theology to this day. I think to the point where many federal visionists have just dropped the concern of coherence. Like they don't care if two things that they say contradict, because in the end they don't affirm in some way that you can make theological statements and those be definitively true such that they can contradict each other. There's always like an approximation dancing around what actually is true. And that has led to all sorts of problems. And then when they're confronted by people who do believe that there are true and false theological statements and that two true statements cannot contradict, they run into problems, and there's church courts, and they run around all this stuff, and eventually people leave because they can't handle it. But anyway, that is the yeah. Now, what this implies for politics, and this is reflected in the broad Protestant tradition, is that because man retained his natural gifts, even though they were diminished, there still is a lot to learn about politics and ethics and rhetoric and home economy or home management from the non-Christian world. So the reason why Calvin would quote various pagan authors, the reason why Turretin would do that, why everyone would do that, is because of a good principle. Namely, that though they did not have the light of the heavenly kingdom, though they lacked the supernatural or the higher gifts that would order themselves properly, nevertheless, they retained these gifts such that they could enjoy civil life, comprehend the principles behind civil laws, and have actually a lot of good things to say about these various disciplines. So that is why they they appealed to those people. It wasn't just some holdover from the Middle Ages. It wasn't because that's what they learned and that's just the way the schools were. There was actually good reason and good principle behind why they did that. And so let's look at, so you remember, let's see. Consider themselves reformed. The implication told depravity. In education, politics, economics, art, and culture, faith is seen as largely irrelevant and not requiring transformation. Now, the classic position is that there is a sort of transformation that needs to take place, but there's also a lot that needs to be retained. So because natural man could discern in principle and in practice often did discern truths with regard to earthly life, there is a lot to retain. Nevertheless, there is also plenty to correct. So grace assumes nature, the goods of nature, but it also corrects the abuses of nature. So you can say that a pagan nation becoming a Christian nation can retain a lot of things that they already had. There's plenty of laws that they would keep, but there would also be a lot of laws that would be rejected. The principle, the most of those laws would concern religious things and superstition. All those would be corrected by grace. But there's a lot of things that would be retained. So if you want to call that transformation, fine. But I think the Ezra Institute guys think is that when a nation becomes Christian, it's fundamentally transformed. It's fundamentally, as in the fundamentals, as in the very foundation of it's overthrown. The political system would have to change, almost certainly, like fundamentally change. The laws would have to be upended. The social life would have to be upended, because the gospel to them contains within it everything, a sort of blueprintist model, such that you take this, and then you just put it in every single nation, such that really every nation would be the same same political system, the same laws, the same cultural life. I'm not talking about the same religious life. I'm talking about even those in earthly everything would have to be rejected, because their view of total depravity is that it extends to the very fundamental nature of man, such that once what that produces is all going to be bad. And so it has to be rejected. Whereas the Reformed position was, you could say, a moderate position between the two extremes, which was there's plenty of good to affirm and plenty of abuse to reject and to replace. So that's that. So these are old Facebook posts that I'm going to pull up just to talk about it. So here's Franciscus Junius writing this in, I think it's like in the 1590s. It's in his, I think this is from his Mosaic Polity. It says, since human beings living according to pure nature either would have known supernatural life and grace, which chooses life by natural law, or would even gain it naturally, I think it should say wouldn't. It was necessary that a law superior to nature be added by the grace of God. Now, Junius is interesting because he retains the supernatural natural distinction. This is a bad quote, because he said they wouldn't have known supernatural life and grace, which leads to life that is higher life, because natural law itself does not contain that. It was necessary that there would be something higher. So Junius affirms that this is actually consistent with what Calvin says. So let's go to the next one. This is Bavinck. Remember that Stephen Perks said that it's a religious confession. Well, he said the doctrine of the incapacity for good is a religious confession in light of the standard people usually follow in their daily life or in philosophic ethics. One can wholeheartedly admit that much of what people do is good and beautiful. So he's affirming that the incapacity for good refers primarily to the inward nature of man and to your practices in religion. So, by the way, he's making a distinction between religion and the rest of life. So there's another dualism, I suppose. But he's saying that that's the principal effect of the incapacity for good. So people can, and in substance, outwardly and in partly inwardly, do good action, but it's never actually good in its totality. It's never recognized as good by God because it's not done to the glory of the true God. And Christians can do good works to the glory of the true God in Christ. Okay, so that's that. So again, even Bavinck, I would say, like I said, I think the Ezra guys are not even in the same theology as the Neo-Calvinists. They're like a sort of neo-Kuyperianism rooted in Duiverd and Van Til and expressed in the late 20th century. So the rest of the Reformed tradition does not affirm largely the distinctives of the Ezra guys. Now, that doesn't mean that one side's right and one side's wrong, but it means a few things. One, I think the default position should be, your default position should be what the majority in your tradition have affirmed. And the reason for that is they were interested in systematic theology in which their beliefs cohered in a system. And so oftentimes when you start meddling with this doctrine and you have a view opposite of the Reformed tradition in that doctrine, it starts to affect your other doctrines. If you reject the invisible, visible church distinction, that affects your view of the sacraments. It affects the view of ecclesiology, your view of the ministry. It affects your view of, did I say justification? It affects justification. It affects all sorts of things. It has cascading effects in your system. The reason why the Reformers affirmed the invisible, visible church distinction was because justification by faith is an inward reality. It's not simply an outward set of works. It's not simply baptism. It is an actual inward trust in Christ. And so in that way, since you can't see the inward, you can't see the internal reality of man, for that reason, there is a sort of invisibility, and the true elect are known only truly and perfectly by God, such that there is a distinction between visible and invisible. This is true even for the Baptists. The Baptists like to talk about, we're a regenerate church. Well, you can't actually see true regeneration. You can only see external evidence of it. Okay? So even the regenerate church people cannot actually come to a regenerate church. It would lead you to Roman Catholicism, because Roman Catholicism affirmed that it's the baptism that brings you in, and the visible outward church is really all there is, and you're in if you were baptized in and you do the various practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Whereas the Protestant view is that actually you're in the church in its essence if you have true inward faith, which is invisible and known by God, and so only the true elect, which means a visible church is a mixed multitude of believer and unbeliever. Okay, so that's why. So the point being, if you deny a distinction that is common in the Reformed tradition and you think it through, it has cascading effects upon the rest of your theology. And so again, the default position should be trusting the Reformed tradition. That doesn't mean they're right. It just means that's your default position, because thousands of smart people thought this through. I forget what the second reason was now. But anyway. All right, so that's Bavinck. The next one, now this is a little confusing, but this is Turretin's. So Turretin's writing, I think this is the 1670s. So this is like 70 plus years after Junius, and about nearly, over 100 years after Calvin. He has natural in different ways. So you can think of natural as originally and subjectively drawn from nature. Something could be natural in an original and subjective way. It's born together and deeply implanted. And this is opposed to adventitious, which is something that comes wholly from the outside. And then you have the second one is constitutively constituting the nature of the thing. So constitutive parts are going to be the essential features of that thing, such that if you lack that thing, you no longer are that thing. Right? So you are not a human being if you lack these constitutive properties. And then there's the perfective features, which agree with the nature, adorn it, and perfective. And then you have the transitive one as well. When it comes to nature and grace, or the higher things and the lesser things, they are original and subjective. This is why you see the word con-created. They're created with. They're drawn from nature, but those higher gifts, you can call them accidental, meaning that they can be lost without removing the nature of the thing, kind of like someone has hair and then he gets cancer and goes bald. He's still a human being, even though he doesn't have hair. So hair, I mean, that's a bad example, but that's that sort of thing where the loss of that feature does not constitute the loss of the sort of thing you are. So the things of grace, even though they are originally and they're concreated, they're born together and deeply implanted, meaning that they actually constitute the completeness of man, they can be removed. But the things that are constitutive cannot be removed without eliminating the sort of thing that thing is. And that's the number two. Number three, so you can think of the things of grace as being both original and perfective. So it's not constitutive, but it is original and perfective. And so that means when the grace of regeneration is perfecting or completing, precisely because those things are necessary for your completeness. They're necessary for your perfection. They're necessary for your righteousness. Remember, as I said, that the higher gifts, they're originally and perfectively there, and they constitute a essential feature of your righteousness as a human being, but they are not constitutive of you as such. So they can be removed, thereby you lose your perfection, you lose what was deeply implanted in you, but you're still man, but you're actually now corrupted, you're unrighteous, and the grace of perfection restores that unto your perfection. Okay, so that's what Turretin is saying here. All right, so I think that that covers mainly what I wanted to say. He goes into Arminian doctrine, and then he says the biblical doctrine, and he rejects. I think the issue here, I think the main issue here is he's juxtaposed the wrong positions. He doesn't understand the complexity within the Roman Catholic tradition. He doesn't understand the fact that the majority of the Reformed affirm the dualisms, including the distinction of nature and grace, and they did it for good reason. You saw Calvin talk about reason being an essential component, that they can that fallen man can comprehend the principles behind the civil laws. That is, they can comprehend the natural principles from which those good civil laws flowed. And none of this is a donum superaddendum. That would be the addition of an additional substance on top of innocent man that then keeps man in check, as the golden bridle from Bellarmine. The Reformed largely rejected that. Now, Junius is a little confusing in that he seems to affirm it, but as I think as things developed, and I think this is a true development, they developed from that Roman Catholic distinction into what I mentioned with Turretin. So you have the distinctions of what's natural. So what's original, subjective, and then what's constitutive, and then what's perfective, and then he has transitive as well. That would be more like it's natural to get married, or it's natural to have children, that sort of thing. Something that is like from your nature, it leads you by instinct to something. But anyway, so it's not the same thing. I would argue that that Bavinck, though what's described here, what's rejected in this piece is actually what Bavinck himself affirms, and everyone else in the Reformed tradition. And again, this just speaks to the fact that, like, oh, I know what this is the second reason why we should just trust the Reformed tradition. Not trust, it's that we should at least kind of chill out a bit. This is one of my arguments. Like I've said, like every time someone says, I can't believe Wolfe said this, and then I show like 10 theologians from Calvin on all the way through who said the exact thing. I think that if people in your tradition said something and the majority or basically universally said something, then you, as someone who's in that tradition, you can reject that. I mean, that's fine, but at least chill out a bit. Why are you losing your mind about, Stephen Wolfe affirming what most other people affirmed? Why? You can reject it and still acknowledge that he's just following the tradition, or he agrees with the tradition. If you admire 100 theologians from the Reformed tradition and 100 of them say this thing, then your posture towards that should be, okay, yeah, I guess that's acceptable. I'm not going to lose my mind or freak out about it, or say like, if you believe these things, you're going to become Roman Catholic, or they're all Roman Catholic, as if like these thousands of guys who thought about theology just didn't think it through. All this stuff is Romanist. They just picked it up from the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, uncritically, and we here at the Ezra Institute, we're completing the Reformation in 2024. That just speaks. I don't want to say arrogance. That's not really. I don't want to get into that. But I think if you don't want to give deference as a sort of default setting to what the majority affirmed, it's raining hard out there. Then at least kind of chill out a bit. Somehow these reformers were able to create, say, political systems and political structures, despite having the quote Romanist doctrine of nature and grace, despite having all the dualisms you think are just insane. I think the conversation would move forward if we all just said, and this is something I preach about Joel Webbin. Joel Webbin has acknowledged, let me get my time right. Joel Webbin has acknowledged that a lot of the things as he said does not fit with the majority position of the Reformed tradition. And because of that, we can have nice, great conversations about it. We can talk about these things. But that's not happening because I say that grace perfects nature, which everyone said, and people in the Ezra Institute and others lose their mind. Or if I quote Aristotle, which everyone did, they lose their mind. If I have a positive appreciation for some aspects of Thomas Aquinas, which most did, and most, in a way, thought he improved the system of doctrine and could borrow from some things from him, then you should not lose your mind over that. You should say, oh, he's going to metaphysics. Well, there's a whole other video on the fact that I think Ezra Institute, as much as they hate the Enlightenment, that actually their system of thought in almost every sphere, from politics to metaphysics to economics, to natural theology, all follows perfectly from aspects of the Enlightenment, from the Scottish Enlightenment, from the German Enlightenment, from the French Enlightenment. That's a whole other video I'll do in the future, right? I think that actually their theology reflects the Enlightenment far more than anyone's. It's actually very, very interesting. Anyway, I will leave it at that. Hopefully this was helpful. And so read the piece at Ezra Institute. Thank you for liking and sharing. Don't forget my Scholars series. And again, thank you very much. See you guys next time.